Okay, this is Diana from Juego de Pomos in English for the very first time in our 4-year history. I am here at the International Book Fair of Guadalajara interviewing the wonderful Emmi Itäranta.
Hello.
She's a writer from Finland and she's here with us today to talk about her book, The Memory of Water. In Spanish is La Memoria del Agua. Bueno, voy a dar una pequeña introducción en español. Luego la entrevista encontrarán que tiene subtítulos en español, pero estoy hoy en la Feria Internacional del Libro, súper emocionada de entrevistar por primera vez para Juego de Pomos en inglés a una autora internacional. Ella es Emmi Itäranta, es una escritora finlandesa que viene a la FIL con su libro La Memoria del Agua, que está súper bonito. Ya me eché algunos extractos en Google Books y ya les platicaré bien cuando lo lea completamente. Ok, entonces vamos a comenzar la entrevista. Okay, Emmi, let's begin. So, I was reading that you, the genre of this novel is, from what I read, it's fantasy, like dystopian fantasy. And
Or maybe science fiction.
Science
fiction.
fiction.
I'm not too precious about the genre label, so you can call it whatever you like.
Okay, very good, I like that. So, when you began writing this book, you didn't have in mind any genre, you just began writing and flow.
Yeah, that's right. When I started writing, I didn't really know at the time it was going to become a book. I started writing a story about a world with very little fresh water left, and a young woman in that world struggling with water. And I didn't really realize at the time that it was going to become a novel. I didn't have a genre in mind. I only saw this character, this young woman, somewhere in a dry future world, preparing tea for herself with the last drop of water that she still had left. And it was this image in my mind that came to me. And the story began to grow from there. So originally I wasn't thinking in terms of fantasy or science fiction or dystopia. I was just writing a story about a character that I wanted to know more about, because I wanted to know how she had ended up in that situation, and that's how it began to grow. But a few chapters into the story, I realized that if you wanted to put a label on it, you could probably call it a dystopia or maybe science fiction, and that's when I sort of looked into dystopian science fiction a little bit more to have a context for what others have done in that genre or subgenre, and what I could do with mine that uses the genre tropes but is not confined by them, maybe goes in some ways against them as well.
Okay. It strikes me very strongly as a creator that you began in a very organic way with an image, like a picture, like a painting, like a drawing in your head. And I find it extremely beautiful because The Memory of Water, it's a story about, it's located in Lapland, right? It's in Lapland in Finland, and from what you can tell from the novel, the geopolitical structure of the world has moved, and it seems like Finland has been conquered by the Chinese, some sort of Chinese colony, and this gives you a sense of dislocation, and the prose, it flows like really smooth. It's really like water, how Emmi manages to write the prose in a very fluid way. And also what also struck me strongly is that emotions run in a very same way. You can tell that there are strong emotions running underneath, but it's also like underwater current. I don't know if you had this in mind, or also this sort of describing the imagery or the emotions is part of who you are as a person, or it appeared when you started developing the main character, and the name of the girl is Nuria.
Yes. That's a very lovely way of describing it, and I'm so happy that you picked up on the idea of the prose being like the flow of water, because that's something I definitely was trying to do when I was writing. I didn't know if I was going to succeed.
You did!
Thank you. But it's something that I very much had in mind from the beginning, because I realized very early on that the story was going to be about water and how central water is to human life. So I decided to try to write also in a way to use the kind of language that imitates the flow of water. That was definitely something I was trying to do there.
And how was the challenge of, because I read that Emmi wrote this novel simultaneously in English and Finnish.
Yes.
How was the challenge? You were switching from one language to the other in a parallel way, or you finished one first and then another?
I wrote the two versions in parallel, so it actually, again, it was a very sort of organic process. I didn't plan originally to write in two languages, but it just sort of happened along the way, because when I had written a couple of chapters in English, I realized that it would be good to get some feedback from my Finnish writing group, and they said, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable reading in English, so I translated the first couple of chapters into Finnish for them. And when I did that, I realized that actually working in the two languages in parallel helped me polish the writing, and I enjoyed the interaction between the two languages. So I ended up writing the whole thing in parallel. So I didn't finish one version first in one language and then translate the whole thing. It was more like each chapter had several versions in each language before I moved on to the next chapter. So it was a sort of very, very organic parallel process.
And this brings us back to the water quality of your writing, the way you flowed into English and then Finnish and then English.
That's
and then
right,
Finnish
yeah.
again.
I never thought of it in those terms, but you're right, yeah.
Yes, like a stream, that has these soft curves. Well, that's how I'm picturing it. And also in this book, you talk about the profession of the characters, of the main characters. They are tea masters. How did you come up with this profession? Is it something that is really strong in Finland? Is there a tea culture over there, or do you particularly love tea? How was this?
Yeah, no, Finland doesn't have any kind of tea culture at all. What we have when people drink tea in Finland, nowadays, of course, we get a lot of teas from everywhere in the world, but traditionally Finns are coffee drinkers. So there's no tea culture traditionally in Finland at all, and definitely not anything like in the book. I got the idea because at the time when I started writing the book, I was very interested in Japanese tea culture in particular, and Japanese tea ceremony. I sort of came across this idea when reading about Japanese tea culture that the old Japanese tea masters held the quality of the water as a very important thing as part of the process, because it would make a huge difference to how the tea tastes. And I thought that fit really well with the idea of being in a dry future world where fresh water is not easily available. So in my mind I constructed this whole backstory where, because of climate change, a lot of people have had to leave their homes as climate refugees because of sea level rise. And in my mind, Nuria's ancestors came originally from Japan or somewhere in Southeast Asia, and they settled in Finland because that was one of the few places where they were able to find the sort of pure fresh water that they needed for their profession in the changing world. So that was the backstory. It's not in the book, so a lot of people have asked me about it. How come you have tea masters and this sort of Japanese Asian influence in northern Finland? And it's because of this backstory.
Oh, that's really good. I am also personally fascinated by Japanese culture. And also another theme in the novel, at least in the part that I read, it's that Nuria's father, who is I think it's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, tea master in Lapland, and he talks to Nuria about how water and death are very closely running together. How did you got that association of death with water?
Well, it was because I started looking early on in the writing process. I started looking into different mythologies and mythological meanings of water in different cultures around the world. And it really struck me that practically everywhere, water is really closely connected with myths that have to do with creation and life. But then I thought there's also obviously has to be a downside to this. If you talk about life, you cannot ignore death entirely. And then I realized that there are also a lot of myths connected with water that have to do with death. Like, for instance, in Egyptian mythology, when Osiris is cut into pieces
Yes.
and thrown into the river of death, and then Isis puts him back together. We also have a Finnish version of that same story, in the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala. There's a sort of variation on the same story. And also there are all these myths around the world about the Great Flood that wipes the earth clean and kills a lot of people, almost everyone, except
Yes.
a few who are on the boat.
On the boat.
Yeah. So I realized that water is not only connected with life in different cultures and mythologies, but it's also very closely connected to death. And I brought that into the book, and also because I don't want to spoil anything for you about the plot, but mortality and death are also central themes in the book. So that was one reason to bring it in early on.
Okay, as an author, is that like a personal obsession for you? Is it present in, like, I know that you have another book, which is called the City of Woven Streets,
Yeah.
which I also want to read. And is that theme central?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I published 2 novels so far, and they definitely have some themes in common. Water is also important in the City of Woven Streets, but it's there in the shape of floods. So in memory of water, there's not enough of it. In the City of Woven Streets, there's too much.
There's too much.
Yeah. So yeah, it does seem to be something that I come back to as a writer. I think I'm just interested in all the mythological associations and connotations and possibilities of water in terms of storytelling and narrative. Plus also it's a very sort of timely thing when we think about our world and climate change, which is going to have a huge impact on freshwater resources and sea level rise. So it's something that when I look at the world around me, I cannot ignore it, I cannot forget about it.
Okay, and let me talk you about the story. The story of the book, as Emmi has told us, is set in a dystopian future, a future that doesn't sound so far away from what we are living today. It has this frightening quality of closeness about it, and there's this girl Nuria that we talked about her a little early, and she's the daughter of a tea master, and she is learning the ways of the tea from her father. And one day when she's 17 years old, her father takes her to this network of caverns on which she used to play when she was a little girl, but she never found anything inside those caves when she went to play there with her friend Sanja. But this time her father takes her and shows her a secret stream, like secret river, secret underwater water source. Yes. And the father tells her that she has to be quiet about it, and she has to pretend it doesn't exist. And also in the book, Nuria, she's a very, I like her a lot. She's this very sensitive and smart girl, and I love the train of thoughts that she has, which also flow like water. She's like very calm, but very strong feelings, but in the same way they manage to flow in a calm way. I don't know if it's the environment in which she lives, which seems calm, but it's very heavily, being patrolled by these military people, And how much of you is in Nuria? I wanted to know.
Well, this is always a difficult one because Nuria is not meant to be a self-portrait. She is meant to be a fictional character who is different from me as an author. And I definitely did see her as a character separate from me. I mean, when I was writing the book, as I already mentioned, she came to me originally as a sort of image in my mind, and I wanted to know more about her. So I always felt with her that she existed somewhere in some fictional reality, and I just had to keep asking her about her life. So it very much felt like she was a real, well, not real, but a very sort of fully formed fictional character, separate from myself. That said, I think because as a writer I lean towards certain ways of writing, and also because it was my first book, I think it does bear some traits of how I am as a person. So I do have some things in common with Nuria. We are both quite happy living inside our own heads sometimes, a lot of the time, rather than being focused on action in the world around us. We spend a lot of time inside our mind and imagination and thoughts. She's also quite introverted like I am. Yeah, those are probably the main things that we have in common. So I would be lying if I said that Nuria is not in any way like me at all. She is in some ways a lot like me, but also she's different.
Yes, but because I always think that artists are always self-portraying in one way. Or
In
the
some
other.
ways, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. Because we don't write. Even if we try to write outside ourselves, we cannot step entirely outside ourselves. So there's always a part of us in what we write.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. So and I read that you this is your first novel, and you are very. I think you're very lucky because your novel has already been translated into a lot of languages.
So lucky.
Yes.
I can't believe it.
How did that happen to you? You know, the novel it came out in 2014. But
in English.
In English?
Yeah, in Finnish it was published in 2012.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
so how has been the process of the Memory of Water flowing slowly into this huge editorial world in multiple languages?
Yeah, it's been very surprising for me because when I was writing it, like I said, I first wasn't even sure that I was working on a novel, and then when I was able to admit to myself that I was writing a novel, I was still quite uncertain whether anyone would ever be interested in having another look at it. I didn't necessarily think that it was ever going to find a publisher. So every day I went back to the manuscript. There was this uncertainty of, will anybody ever read this? Will anybody ever publish this? Am I just wasting my time with this book? And originally, when I finished the book in 2010, 2010. I started writing. I started sending the manuscript to agents in the UK where I live, and to publishers in Finland. And I started getting rejections. So I think I collected about 13 rejections in total, and I felt like I had already tried my luck with anyone who might be interested, so I was starting to lose hope. And I sent the finished manuscript to a writing contest in Finland. There was a small Finnish publishing house looking for fantasy and science fiction books. So I sent the manuscript to the contest and then continued to collect more rejections. And I think with the contest we were supposed to hear back by the end of June or something like that year, and I had not heard anything by the end of June, so I thought, okay, it was a waste of time, no success there. And then a couple of weeks later I had a phone call from Finland telling me that I had won the contest with the manuscript. So that's how I got my first book deal, because part of the win was that I got a book deal with a publishing house. And then from there on I got an agent who basically got in touch with me. I had been in touch with her earlier and he had nothing back. But after I won the contest, she got back in touch with me and said,
I'm back.
I'm back. Would you still like to? Would you still like to, work together? So I signed up with her, and she started working on selling the international rights. And little by little, she first managed to sell them to Germany, and then from there. A little bit later we got the English rights sold, and that was the big one, which was basically the breakthrough, and from there followed a lot of other publishing contracts in other countries, because once you sort of have a deal in a large area like English rights or something like that, that really helps selling the other translation rights. But it's been a long process. There have been quite a few setbacks along the way when I thought that a book was never going to be picked up by anyone. And also I feel, I always say that it's been a lot of hard work, and it has, but I think it's also fair to say that I have been tremendously lucky. I think it's been a combination of hard work and some really fortunate timings that I could not have anyway arranged myself. They just happened. So, I basically feel that with the luck I've had with this book, I've sort of used all the luck I have available for me. I don't necessarily expect any other book of mine to be successful the same way in the future, because it feels like something that only comes an author's way once during their career.
You never know.
You never know, but
you never know, because
yeah,
I can picture this book perfectly as a TV series or as a movie. It's very cinematography.
Yeah,
it's very visual also.
Yeah, the movie rights have been sold. It's not necessarily going to happen. I sold the option to a Finnish production company.
Oh my God,
and they have been working on thank you. They've been working on a script for a while now, but we still don't know if it's actually going to go into production, because these are very long processes. So fingers crossed.
Oh my God, fingers crossed. All the fingers crossed for you. Oh, it makes me very, very happy to speak with others like you, with so much. You are very humble and yet so talented and so open to talk about all the real work that comes behind a book. It's really years and years of hard work, and I appreciate a lot that you have given us this interview. And do you have any final words, any encouraging words for our audience to step into this wonderful The Memory of Water world of Emmi Itäranta? You have to buy it, but you have to read it. But what would you say to them, so that they take the final step and get it?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I feel very awkward about talking about the book, so I think I'm rather going to say something towards, just as a general encouragement because for me this book was a big dream come true. I pursued writing it because I wanted to write a book, and because I was hoping that I would get a book published some way. So, you probably have a dream of your own somewhere out there, something you really want to do and something you really want to pursue. Keep at it. Don't give up on it. It is going to be a lot of hard work, but if you put the hard work in and do it because you love it and for no other reason, you will at some point find someone else who loves it too. I believe that.
Thank you very much. I think that books are like messages inside a bottle. All art forms looking for the specific audience that understands it, and really you get to be seen and understood. Thank you very much, Emmi. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You're really nice. I hope we keep in touch.
Yeah,
if you ever come to Guadalajara again, please reach me, call me, and we can do another thing. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hasta luego. Muchísimas gracias. Esto fue mi